Tim, you've been researching, exploring, studying, writing about nutrition, to me at least, for a good decade now. And I thought what would be interesting is to start by talking about where you've changed your mind. Perhaps some foods that you previously thought were healthy and were going to help you with your short-term and your long-term health, but you've now realized that's not the case.
Well, there's plenty of them because, I sort of came into this when I first started, over a decade ago with a fairly open mind. Well, I'd say that, but in retrospect, it was the sort of traditional medical mind, which is what we've been spoon-fed. As I've dug deeper and deeper into this, obviously new things are coming up all the time, and the evidence is changing. And I think that's what's really exciting about nutrition, is that it's not standing still; it is changing, and we need to treat it much more like a science than a religion.
Bananas, I believe, is something you've changed your mind on.
Bananas, yeah. Well, you're hitting me with bananas straight off, but yes, they were my go-to fruit. So I don't know about you, and probably many people. I think they're the number one fruit people eat in probably the US and the UK. It comes in its own packaging, so you can stick it in your rucksack when you cycle to work and have it as a snack. And it was pretty much my go-to fruit every day, and I thought it was always going to be healthy for me and really good. And by doing my research into bananas in great detail for the book, I've discovered that maybe not so great to have it every day. Still, all of these things you can have every now and again, no problem. But for me, it was because of personalization, actually, that I discovered that bananas for me were actually something I shouldn't be having every day, because they gave me sugar spikes. And when I did the Zoe test, when we started, even before it was commercially available, I was looking at my normal diets and seeing what spiked it. And it turns out that bananas gave me a sort of moderate sugar spike every time I had them. So as a snack, as a sort of quick on-the-go alternative to lunch if you're too busy, they're fine occasionally, but for me, they were not something I should be having. And since I've discovered what my scores are, I know that they don't have as much fiber, they're not as good for your gut microbes, and they do have this ready available sugar in them. I'm much better off having other fruits instead. So I've thrown them out of my rucksack. I don't, and it's quite good because I don't have all these rotting bananas in my fruit bowl, which I used to put in the freezer and then try and make smoothies out of. I don't have that problem anymore. I just get apples and pears, which for me on my personalized scoring give me like double the score. So a banana, I don't know, I can't remember exactly. I think gave me about a score of about 30, which means I can sort of have it occasionally. This is the Zoe scores out of 100. And apples and pears are more like 60 or 70 for me. So that was a clear indication that what I thought was a fruit I would recommend to everybody doesn't turn out to always be that way. And of course, also bananas, we're only having one variety of banana now in the world because of the sort of monoculture. It's a great example also of how we used to have hundreds of varieties of bananas, and now there's just one. And we all have exactly the same type of banana, which is sterile and could be wiped out at any minute. So we shouldn't become over-dependent on the banana for that reason. But I do know that my wife tests herself, and her scores for bananas are much higher than mine. So it does depend who you are. But bananas have gone out of my rucksack.
There's so much there. I mean, the first thing that came up as you were talking about bananas is I distinctly remember in the 80s, I think it was the 80s, when Michael Chang was playing at Wimbledon, and tennis player, and, often at his break, when in between, after 2 games, when they'd be sitting there in their seats, he'd get out a banana and peel it and eat it. And I can remember my dad saying something like, "Hey, Ron, look, bananas, really, really good source of potassium. That's why he's having them. They're going to help him." So I was infused with this message at a young age, like many of us are, that bananas are a perfect, if you will, a superfood. I'm not sure that term existed in the 80s, but they're a very healthy foods. And I think what you have just demonstrated there, Tim, is this concept of personalization. And I'm really fascinated by that, especially because you started off, I think, your career looking at epidemiology, right? Which my understanding of that is we're looking at a lot of populations. So your book really covers this beautifully, but I think you explaining how you have big sugar spikes or moderate sugar spikes to a banana mean that it shouldn't necessarily be daily in your cereal, if you still eat cereal. We'll come to that later. But for your wife, it seems to be okay. So maybe talk a little bit about your journey from being an epidemiologist, looking at populations, to how you got to this point where now you understand that each and every single one of us respond differently, often to the same foods.
Yeah, well, that's a big question because you're absolutely right. My sort of early career was all about finding risk factors. So I would do a big study of several thousand people and say, well, for example, does eating bananas make you more likely to get heart disease or diabetes, or does it prevent? And generally, most studies would show that people who eat bananas are protective for these, because generally people who eat bananas probably have other healthy lifestyles, etc. But it tells you nothing about the banana and the individual. And the epidemiology I used to do, I think, is most of those studies have been done, those very large scale ones, observational ones, looking at association between eating a certain foods and getting a disease. It was always aimed at these groups, and the power of it was in the group. So it wasn't until I got ill personally that I started actually worrying about the individual. It was very selfish, actually, to try and say, well, how do we sort this out? And when I was working on genetics, there was this idea that because of our genes, we would all subdivide into these little groups of people, that some people would have the gene for eating bananas properly and others wouldn't. And it turned out that's not the case. It wasn't, genes weren't really good enough at doing that, apart from just for milk and alcohol and maybe coffee. They can't separate us out into these other groups. So there was other things going on. And it was this individual journey of my poor health, and then testing myself, that suddenly got this insight that everyone responds differently. And we come back to that sort of classic, the Zoe Predict study that showed, given the same food, everyone responds 10 to 20-fold differently to an identical food in terms of sugar and fat peaks. So the realization that what could be a reasonable, healthy food for some people might not be as good for others has been a sort of slowly evolving idea, I think. I don't think there was necessarily a eureka moment in that. But the other point is that we shouldn't get too obsessed with one food. Yeah. And I think I don't want anyone listening to get the idea that, they have to ban bananas if they have a blood sugar control like myself. We should be able to eat any proper food, but it means that we don't necessarily have it every day, or that we have it with other things that are much more important. So it's this holistic view of food we have to get away with, which in a way is, but you're talking about you and your dad and watching Wimbledon. We're obsessed with this banana because it had these magical potassium properties that got Michael Chang, going in the fifth set and hanging on to victory. And he said, oh, every kid wants to have that banana so they can, play soccer, and not fall over and get cramp. But it turns out that actually there's many more fruits and vegetables that have more potassium than banana anyway. It was like this massive, great PR campaign.
Maybe it was Big Banana paying Michael Chang.
It was probably the sugar in it anyway. But we all have these habits, and so at the same time, we're all human, and it's not possible to vary your fruit snack every single day and have this range of 20 different tropical fruits that you can take, to work or to school or wherever it is. So we do have to pick some, but just a simple change from a banana to a pear can have a very big difference for some people.
Have you noticed a difference since you didn't snack on bananas compared to when you did? And I'll tell you where I'm going with this, Tim. You have used the CGM, continuous glucose monitor, to help you understand what certain foods are doing for you. I like you think they can be very, very helpful tools if used responsibly. And if given with good education and a good, help people understand what it actually means. I think they can be misused as well, of course. And it's interesting, not everyone yet has access to this. There's a cost element to it. And I think a lot about health tech. I have real concerns over some health tech. I think sleep trackers can be incredibly problematic for a lot of people. Yes, they can be helpful for sure in the short term for some people, but I think for many people, they cause more anxiety in the long run. But what interests me is how we can use trackers like a CGM to help us be more in touch with our own bodies. For example, when I eat a food like this, let's say a banana, and I have a big sugar spike and then a sugar crash 2 to 3 hours later, I feel hungry again. I feel a bit jittery. I feel a bit of brain fog. Oh, when I stop doing that and I'm having an apple instead, let's say, I don't have that drop 2.5 hours later. Was there anything like that you have started to notice since? And I know we're going into one food, the banana at the moment, but have you noticed that as you have understood which foods give you sugar spikes compared to others, that as you made those changes, you become more in tune with yourself?
I'd love to say yes, but the reality is I'm not particularly sensitive to these changes, and I'm usually surprised by my blood sugar result. And I know that's not the same for other people. I know some people are very sensitive. They can sort of predict when they're having that the sugar dip at 3 hours that we recently published on. Some people seem to be able to pick it up, others can't. I guess I'm usually too busy doing something to be focusing on myself. It'd be an interesting experiment to actually say, or to sort of guess what's going on. Blind yourself to your sugar, which is sort of what a lot of people do when they are testing themselves, with these CGMs or with the Zoe programs or whatever. But I think there are different categories of people, just like we found that people who have a sugar dip below baseline, which everyone has it occasionally, but some people have them regularly. About 1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 men have a 3-hour dip below the baseline, and but only those people will report feeling less energy and hungrier, etc. But so not everyone has a sugar dip. And I think you notice the dips more than you do the peaks. So I think there's a difference between people. So I'm not a big dipper, actually. It turns out, whereas other people might be. So I didn't tend to really. The only time I've noticed it was when I was eating these rather controversial Zoe muffins, which some people love and most people hate, every 4 hours for 24 hours, and my trace was like it was like a mountain range, just going up and down. I felt terrible. But I felt terrible for a whole 24 hours.
That's a lot of people's norm.
Yes. That's the average UK and US diet on ultra-processed foods and high sugar. And but it's not my norm. And so I really noticed that. Now, that was, I'd say that's the worst diet-related experience I've had. Wow. I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't work on my book. I couldn't do anything. And when I looked at my trace, I sort of saw exactly why it was. It was just going from one high level to a low level, and it really messed up my brain. But I don't think my makeup is such that I can detect these small changes of a banana. But I think it's still illustrative that you can do that. And so the difference between a banana and an apple, personally, I don't think I noticed that, but I think other people might well do.
But it's also, you've made other changes as well, right? So, there's a pattern of eating now you're probably doing in a way that you weren't. And therefore, certainly for me, and I think we touched on this last summer when you were last on the show, that I had found one of the things a CGM taught me was how much quantity makes a big difference. Like, so for, let's say, white rice, for example, and I want to talk about rice a bit later. I know you've written a whole chapter on rice in the new book. But I like white rice. And as an Indian guy, heritage-wise,
you can't not like it.
White rice, we grow up eating white rice. But too much white rice doesn't do that well for me. I think that's quite obvious, but when you see it on a CGM, you really see what's happening. And I've realized if I can reduce my quantity significantly, and I'm used to it now, like I probably have a third of the amount that I used to. I still can enjoy it, enjoy the flavor, enjoy eating the foods that I'm used to with white rice, but not have these horrible sugar spikes that I know long-term are going to have a high potential to cause me problems. So I found it really, really useful on an individual level. And I have noticed as I made a lot of these changes that my energy is more stable, my cognition is more stable because I'm not getting the sugar ups and downs. Another thing just to finish off on bananas is I had a patient about 4 years ago, and it's really relevant to this part of the conversation, Tim. It was a guy in his mid-40s who was complaining of blurred vision a lot, and in front of computer screens. Also, when walking, sometimes his vision would just go, sort of hazy. Just couldn't see anything. Not one-sided. There was no evidence on examination of any stroke or anything like that. Do you know what it ended up being? It was he would have 2 bananas every morning. With his breakfast because he thought it was healthy. He'd have a snack on a banana later. I think the diet was, quite high in refined carbs and refined sugars. But this is the most starkest example I've seen. And this was without any personalization, without any CGM data. It was as he cut out bananas for 2 weeks and reduced a couple of other things in his diet, it went away completely. Now, I've never seen anything that dramatic. And I would love to go back now and just see what was going on if he did have a CGM at that time, what was happening to the sugar. But that's a pretty extreme case. And I just thought it was worth sharing that because I think it's quite relevant to what you just said.
Yeah, but I think, so I did this extreme experiment just eating these high sugary muffins and felt absolutely awful. And I guess some people who are more sensitive than myself will have this with just by picking the wrong breakfast. And to me, breakfast is the fairly critical point here. So when I changed my breakfast, I felt I didn't need a snack. And so the need to suddenly have that mid-morning banana just wasn't there.
Yeah.
And so, you asked me, so it's very hard to take one food out of this context that when people, are sort of changing their habits, not only, what they eat, but when they eat. And it's all part of this whole picture. And I've just found I don't snack nearly as much now as I used to, because I was being driven to that, as we now know from our research, that, either having ultra-processed foods or high sugary foods, for some people, just makes them hungrier 3 hours later, and they will overeat and they'll be seeking other similar foods to keep it going. So once you break that cycle, you're not as hungry, and you're, as you say, your mental state is much flatter. And now you're remembering, I remember at work in the hospital, I used to go and have my lunch in the canteen. I stopped going to the canteen after a while. You can't face shepherd's pie and chips, for that long. But even I went and got my sandwiches, which I thought were healthy, came back, with my Tropicana or whatever, I really struggle with the afternoon with concentration and tiredness, and I don't get that anymore.
Yeah.
I've that whole idea of, I needed 3 coffees to get me through the afternoon is no longer the same, just because of the changes I've made to my diet, and I think that's really revealing.
Yeah, I think a lot of people still don't realize that often, not always, often their hunger or certain behaviors they engage in, let's say, I need coffee or tea in the afternoon to get me through, is a response. It's a symptom. And we're not addressing the root cause. It's like, no, I'm just that. I need, I get a dip at 3 p.m. I need coffee at 3 p.m. Okay, maybe you do, maybe you don't. Maybe it's because of your breakfast choice or your lunch choice. And I think once people, if they choose to consume breakfast, let's put it this way, once people change the first meal of their day, it is pretty remarkable what can happen. If you have a meal with a stable blood sugar, it is remarkable how many compensatory behaviors you no longer engage in because you don't want to.
Yeah.
You mentioned a couple of things there. You mentioned the hospital sandwich and Tropicana. So in terms of things you change your mind on, we've covered bananas and tried to expand it out beyond bananas, of course. Fruit juice, Tropicana. I remember, Tim, as a junior doctor, I was working medical SHO, Western General in Edinburgh. Was renting a flat opposite it. I thought, I'm a young professional, and I'd go to the Sainsbury's in Edinburgh and I'd buy Tropicana because, I was earning money. I could afford this freshly squeezed, this is what the packet said, orange juice. And I'd have that in my fridge and I'd have it with breakfast. I may have it after work because I thought it was healthy, right? This is a long time ago now.
We all did, yeah.
We all did. So talk to me about fruit juice. What have you changed your mind on there?
Well, they're not healthy. There's virtually no fruit juice that is healthy. We're not deprived of vitamin C. So the original rationale to have this was sort of post-war with people with total lack of fruit, and they used to sort of preserve some of these juices in cans and things. And I still remember as a kid having the first fruit juices, which used to come in cans or reconstituted sort of frozen things before fresh juice was ever available. So for many people, my generation, this was a totally exciting new thing that we could have. And we've just been misled by all the marketing that this is the same as eating oranges. And there's no doubt oranges are healthy, but you wouldn't eat 10 oranges in one go and just use the liquid from it rather than all the fiber and the other good bits. So I think when you compare it and you do these studies, with CGMs, you'll find that drinking a glass of orange juice is actually, for me, it's slightly worse than drinking a Coca-Cola or a Pepsi.
In terms of what?
The blood sugar peak.
And should we just pause here for a second to kind of explain why is it, in your view, important to consider these blood sugar peaks? There's a lot of controversy around CGMs, and I think a lot of the controversy is quite limited in terms of the way they're being viewed. I think it's a pretty sensible, logical conclusion given how many people are suffering with their metabolic health, given how prevalent type 2 diabetes, heart disease, strokes, etc. are, and how much we know metabolic dysfunction can contribute to them. I don't think it requires a huge leap of faith to sort of get to the conclusion that, well, how we manage our blood sugar day to day is going to play a factor. But for people who are coming to this for the first time, Tim, what would you say? Why is what's happening to our blood sugar day to day important?
Everyone has blood sugar peaks. This is part of our natural physiology, and we've evolved to have them. Sugar goes up, it goes into the bloodstream and gets absorbed if we need it, and then insulin is released to bring those levels back down, because too much sugar is, if it hangs around too long, is not good for our body. And what we see in some people are susceptible is very high sugar peaks, which if you have them regularly will predispose you firstly to type 2 diabetes. There's increasing evidence that is the case. That's not really new. What is new is the fact that these sugar spikes, if they are prolonged, then you get inflammation related to it. So it means that the body is under stress and that all the cells in the body are sort of pressurized. They're not happy. And just because that environment for them is causing them distress. And so if you've got distressed cells in your body long term, because you are every 2 hours getting a sugar spike, then over years, that's going to cause considerable harm to you. And that's a really important long-term point that, drinking 1 glass of orange juice is not going to be bad for you. It's having these things as a regular consumption, but also with the fact that it's promoted as a health drink, and promoted to kids as a health drink, and it really should be, come with a health warning, not on the health shelf. So it's the idea of these regular sugar spikes causing stress to the body, inflammation, type 2 diabetes, and all the epidemiology studies show that it is related to heart disease, and there's even some suggesting that it might increase your risk of cancers. So I think that's one reason that we shouldn't be having orange juice, because we've been sold it as a health food that gives us vitamin C and it gives us all these marvelous nutrients you have in an orange, because it's very different. And I explain in the book how most of the orange juice we're drinking is at least 2 years old, even though it's sort of portrayed as fresh, because it's been sitting in some vat in Florida or Brazil and tastes of nothing. And they, when they're ready to ship it over, they add in these taste packets that are these chemicals that give it back the orange taste that they took away, so it doesn't go off. So it's a highly industrialized process. It's not some guy in Brazil and Florida just squeezing an orange and putting it into that pot. It's ultra processed food, and what I object to it is the fact that it's sold as health food and generally regarded that way. That's much worse. I'd much rather people actually drank Coca-Cola, and because it's pretty obvious that's not good for you. That is a treat, but it's nothing says it's great for you and your teeth. Yeah. Whereas orange juice is, in my view, just as bad.
I mean, it's interesting that 2 years old, a lot of the orange juice people drink. I mean, it's not that pleasant a thought. You think about that, freshly, that packet, that carton with the beautiful image of the tropical climate and, someone squeezing it in for you. And I think we all kind of know, if you've ever had freshly squeezed fruit juice, truly freshly squeezed juice, I mean, it's pretty remarkable tasting. In Greece last summer, I remember, I don't have fruit juice. We don't have it in the house. It's not something I consume very much at all. But on my summer holiday last summer, a beautiful day, and I think we were in a cafe when they were doing it. I thought, yeah, you know what? Let's do it. I didn't kid myself. It was good for me, but I really enjoyed it as a treat, and it was absolutely delicious. So I think what you're really talking about, and this is, I think, one of the key themes in Food for Life, is you want transparency. You're not saying people should or shouldn't eat anything. It's more like, if you're going to have fruit juice, just be aware that it may not be a health food.
And have it as a rare treat. Yeah, exactly. And enjoy it and get the very best one, rather than paying every day to have it, or, going to hotels in the US where it's compulsory. They sort of virtually serve it at your table with, the iced water and the orange juice. It's part of the package. And just, we got to say no to that. And as you said, have it as this very special event where you can actually see it coming from the fruit, or eat oranges instead, or do it yourself. squeeze it yourself. Then you know exactly what's in it, and it's impossible to drink as much of it anyway. You're not going to be squeezing 10 oranges every morning before you go to school or work.
If someone says to you, Tim, okay, I understand what you're saying about fruit juice, it's going to spike my sugar, which if I do this day in, day out, is going to cause me problems in the long term, or it has the potential to. And they then say, yeah, but what about freshly squeezed? That's better, isn't it? Because it's not been sat in a factory for 2 years. It's fresh. I've seen what's happened. Can you talk to us about the differences? Is that a better option, or is it still going to do the same thing to our blood sugar, or a similar thing?
It's going to be pretty similar. I think it was going to have less of some of the chemicals and other ingredients that are in the mass-processed ones, and less of the added flavors and things like this. But it's still going to lack the essential ingredients of an orange, which is the fiber content, which is the thing that mops up the sugars, which doesn't give you those big sugar spikes. So, I'm not saying people shouldn't have freshly squeezed orange juice, but realize when you do it yourself at home, you squeeze orange juice, very quickly it sediments out. Right, if you don't stir it, you get the light bit at the top and the dark bits at the bottom, and often even on these freshly squeezed ones you buy in shops, you don't have that. They've added something to it, other chemicals to keep it looking nice. So there are always these subtle differences that we have. But look, I like the occasional orange juice. Let's just have it occasionally. Let's realize it's a bit of a naughty treat, and if you want the goodness of orange juice, have an orange.
And I think people very obviously get it when you explain, look, in a glass of orange juice, there may well be 8 oranges in there. Try and eat 8 oranges. Mm-hmm. You can't do it. You just, with all the fiber in it, the satiety, maybe 2, you're going to struggle to go much beyond that. And certainly that's what I say to my kids when trying to explain this to them. They kind of intuitively understand it when you put it like that. So bananas and fruit juice in many ways both relate to blood sugar and the sugar spikes that are affecting us in the short term and in the long term. I think you've also changed your view on salt, haven't you? Information is not enough to make change in your life. You have to take action. So to help you take action after watching this video, I've created a free nutrition guide for you. This contains the 5 most important practices I've seen in over 2 decades of seeing patients. They work for you no matter what your dietary preference. There's a step-by-step action plan to help you implement those changes in your life. If you want to receive that free guide right now, just click on the link in the description box below.
I have, and this is a very controversial topic, so I'm sure some people listening won't like my views on salt. But I originally, when I wrote the first book on this, Diet Myth, I looked at the salt thing. I said, there's no real controversy there. Every doctor knows that salt is bad for you. We just need to reduce it, right? All the data's there. Then about 6 years ago, I started looking at this in more detail. And there'd been some other recent studies on this, and it was clear that there was a lack of, there's no doubts people on high salt diets can increase their blood pressure. And what wasn't clear was if you put people on low salt diets, how much their blood pressure decreases, and do they get significantly less heart disease and problems. So the sort of causality link wasn't quite there, nearly as much as people expect. They think this is a done deal. So everyone's been focusing on salt, particularly in ultra-processed food, as, all you need to do to make ultra-processed food safe is to reduce the salt, reduce the fat, reduce the sugar. Bingo, you've got the perfect healthy food. And that's the thing that really annoyed me. So I started looking in great detail at salt and saw that there's a huge range in actually how we respond to salt. There's this personalization that no one's really tapped, but if you look in the clinical studies that have been done, you can see big differences between people who are ill with cardiovascular disease or very high blood pressure or who have African origins, they are really quite salt responsive and makes a big difference whether they have salt. But if you take someone with normal blood pressure, European or Asian backgrounds, they are much less responsive. And the difference on changing from a high salt diet to a low salt diet is trivial. And I did this myself. I practiced when I first got diagnosed with high blood pressure. I went for 6 weeks on a low salt diet. It was revolting.
That 6 weeks you'll never get back, Tim.
I know, it's terrible. And I took my blood pressure every day. It didn't change. And I went to look at the results, and it shows that someone like me, similar demographic to myself, would only change about 2 millimeters their blood pressure, right? Which you can't really tell taking your home measurements. It's not enough, a big enough change on average. And so I think it's been oversold to us, the impact of salt. The studies show that people who are on salt-restricted diets often end up with more problems with diabetes and renal failure than people that don't. So the American Heart Association has got these very strict guidelines, which is basically less than half a teaspoon of salt a day, which are very hard to adhere to, makes your food disgusting. And it turns out that the body doesn't like being at those low levels for many people. And so it may be that 10% of people do respond to that low dose and benefit, but most people don't, and some people are actually worse off. So that's the data that I've seen. And what's really interesting is that some new studies showing that it's the sodium-potassium ratio that's important. So salt is sodium chloride, and in our body there's a constant balance in all our cells between the sodium and the potassium. And they have a sort of inverse relationship. So if you increase the potassium, so you're eating your 20 bananas, you actually have a 3 times bigger effect on your blood pressure than you do from reducing your salt. Yeah. And they've done there's a meta-analysis of at least 10 studies showing that if you use these salt substitutes, which are made of where you have about a third of the salt changed to potassium chloride, you get a 3 times bigger effect on the blood pressure. So I think we've been obsessed with reducing salt, whereas everything points to being that's only a minority of people that are sensitive, and that we should really be focusing on increasing vegetables, which are the main source of potassium. And if you do that, then you'll have a much bigger effect as an individual or population level on reducing blood pressure, which, is huge. So again, this is part of this reductionist idea that I'm always going on about in nutrition, that we focus on one thing. We say, okay, let's do that, get the manufacturers to reduce that, and then we're all happy. Whereas what we should have been saying is actually, let's get that balance of sodium to potassium better. How do you do that? Eat more vegetables and fruits. And if we do that, it's going to have a much bigger impact. And it doesn't allow manufacturers to say that some terrible product they've got is now healthier because they've slightly tweaked the salt, which isn't going to make any difference at all to anyone's health.
Yeah. What was interesting as you were telling your story, Tim, for me was you said for 6 weeks you were actively consuming a low salt diet, but your blood pressure wasn't budging. I think it's a really key point here. When we give generalized, unnuanced nutritional advice, I think we can make people feel really, really bad. So I'm trying to do what I'm reading in the newspapers or the health influencers are telling me, yet I'm still struggling with my health. Were you frustrated at all during those 6 weeks? Are you thinking, well, I'm doing this, but it's not making much of a difference to my blood pressure?
Yeah, hugely. And if I hadn't, been a doctor and a scientist and subsequently looked up some of this data and realized that I wasn't abnormal, I'd have felt a failure. And I think that's and they're, and that's well, a lot of people listening might say, well, I followed this advice of my doctor, nothing happened, therefore I'm going to give up all the advice. Yeah. And this is the huge risk we have when we generalize all this advice and we don't personalize it, and we don't say, listen, the data actually shows that yes, on average, you might get a 2% improvement in your blood pressure. It might be hard to measure it, but if you're lucky, you might get a 10% one. And if you're unlucky, nothing will happen. Don't worry about it. Just tell us what you've got. And I think this is this new age we're in now of personalization, of gadgets. I'm wearing a blood pressure little wristwatch now that gives me every half hour my blood pressure. And you don't have to go to a doctor to do all this stuff. You can really, this technology can help us out of this as we realize that we are all individuals and we're going to react not only to foods differently, but interventions and exercise and all the other things that, doctors have been telling us is, that's going to be good for you. This is going to be good for you. Well, it may be, but it may not be. You've got to find out what works for you. And for me, I still love salt, and I've also changed my mind. And I was very against these salt substitutes, but I think for people who do find it difficult to have lots of plants or vegetables, it's quite an easy swap, and there's no evidence they are harmful, although they are rather chemical and ultra processed. So, but the data is pretty clear that when you do swap, you can reduce your blood pressure, by 5 or 6 millimeters, which is quite a lot.
It's interesting. You said there can be a 2% reduction if you go into low salt diets. If the consequence of that, for example, means that you are 50% less likely to stick to your new diet because it tastes so awful, that part of the equation doesn't get factored in. Like, it's very, very reductionist. I think not beyond food. I think a lot of what I've realized now in over 2 decades of practice, Tim, is that there is no one right approach for everyone. Like 10 people can come in with headaches, let's say migraines, and there may well, apart from pharmaceutical medication to help potentially reduce the severity of the headaches, you could have 10 different approaches with their life and their lifestyle to address that very similar symptom, because we're all different. We've all got unique pressures. And I think that nuance is very important. We like salt in our food, many of us. And so you can do something for 6 weeks, maybe, with a view to improving your health. But if it's not sustainable, that whole concept we can expand out to weight loss or whatever sort of things people are trying to improve. You've got a real problem, haven't you?
Well, and just take that example of if you tell people to have no salt, half a teaspoon of salt a day, right? All your vegetables taste rubbish, right? It's one of the most sought after spices that we have. Meat is actually inedible completely without salt, and you want people to, if the holistic advice is to eat more diverse plants and foods, and you're taking away a way of seasoning it properly, it's far worse. So probably, this could explain why these people on low salt diets ended up doing worse.
Yeah,
is probably because what they didn't check is all the other things they were eating and the quality of their foods, et cetera, in these trials. So there are always consequences of these dogmatic reductionist views that don't take the holistic picture. So I think we're in agreement there.
People in the low carb community, I would say for many years, a lot of people in that community have said that, look, the problem is the processed foods, the ultra processed foods. They're the ones that have got these large volumes of salt in them. So potentially the research is relevant if you're consuming a lot of ultra processed foods. If, on the other hand, you are predominantly having a whole food based diet, whatever your brand of that diet is, but it's predominantly whole foods close to their natural form, if you're able to, if that's what you're eating, a lot of them have said for many years, actually, adding salt to your food is not a problem in that context. And again, this just speaks to what we're talking about. Context really matters, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. 100% agree. Ultra-processed food is the problem, not salt. Salt is just one bit of the problem of ultra-processed food. But I'm sure if someone did studies and that, long-term use of ultra-processed foods end up having more strokes and heart disease, and it's all related to that. So it's picking these things apart that is important, and realizing that, as you said, adding salt to a bit of broccoli that you've steam cooked yourself is very different to having a frozen lasagna with masses of salt, or a breakfast cereal that's got lots of added salt to it.
To finish this part of the salt conversation responsibly as medical doctors, what do you then say to the people who are listening or watching, Tim, who say, well, look, my doctor said I've got high blood pressure and they've asked me to reduce my salt intake. How would you help them to move forward?
Well, I think if you've got high blood pressure, you are at high risk of heart disease, strokes, etc., and you should do every experiment you can to see what works for you. So I would get hold of a blood pressure monitor yourself and measure yourself, 2 or 3 times a day, keep a log of it as you change, and do it for a couple of weeks and see what results you get. If it comes down by 5% or so, you say, okay, there might be something in this. Or you simply say, well, I'm already on again, it's all context dependent.
Yeah.
Cutting out the ultra-processed food is the number one thing. Everyone who's told they have, a potential blood pressure problem, a salt problem. But assuming it's someone like you and I who suddenly gets diagnosed with high blood pressure, you can do a little experiment for a couple of weeks, see what effect it has. Are you a very sensitive person or not? That's something everyone can do, right? You can probably put up with it for 2 weeks. It actually makes you appreciate seasoning in food as well for the rest of your life. Then if you can't tolerate it, then of course you might switch your salt for these potassium chloride substitutes, which in the trials show 3 times bigger effect, and then do that for a couple of weeks and then see how you're getting on there. So I think realize that you are different. Realize your doctor may not know all the data, and this is a traditional view that's been around for the last 30 years or so. So it's instilled in every doctor, and just take that individualistic approach. Okay, well that's advice which, on average, might help me a little bit. Is it feasible? But I think that it comes to the other point is every time you get some advice about an intervention, you've got to say to yourself, can I sustain this for the rest of my life?
Yeah.
And if you really can't, or you try it for a few days and realize I can't do it, there's no point.
Yeah.
And you've got to find another way to get there. I think increasingly there's no point in just doing something, being a goody-goody for 6 weeks to impress the doctor if you know that you cannot do that. And
well, that's a problem with a lot of trials, right? They run for 6 weeks or they run for 12 weeks, which is wonderful. But our life doesn't stop 12 weeks after we make a particular change, right? It goes on.
Diet. All the diets work for 6 weeks brilliantly, and yes, you can advertise any diet in the world. The strawberry diet, you could probably have the Tropicana diet,
There is a potato diet which works.
Potato diet, remember the Special K diet. They all work, but that's not for life.
Yeah.
And we've got to start looking at a much longer timescale of all these things. And in a way, that's what we're doing with the Zoe Health studies, trying to instill habits and see how pragmatic it is for people to pursue that. How easy is it to, switch your banana for a pear or an apple and avoid this, or not have orange juice, or reduce your salt long term. You've got to start planning. There's absolutely no point in doing it other than as an experiment. I think it's an interesting thought experiment, and you and I would do that sort of stuff because we're, into hacking and stuff. There might be some other people listening who do it. But for the majority of people, they just want to know what to do to get them healthier, what lifestyle change. And I'd just say to them, if you know it's just unrealistic, go for something else.
Yeah. My passion, Tim, as you know, is beyond food. It's lifestyle as a whole, right? You've written 3 wonderful books on nutrition. It's interesting for me that I've never written a book about nutrition. Nutrition is featured in many of my books, but it's never been the sole topic. And if we talk about blood pressure, for example, people really need to understand, in my view, that it ain't just your food intake either. Like, if you are chronically stressed, what is the stress response? The stress response is preparing you for danger. Your blood sugar goes up, your blood pressure goes up in the acute stress setting, right? So if you're undergoing chronic stress, which is many of us these days, that could be why your blood pressure is going up. If you're sleep deprived, your blood pressure could be up the following day. So if you're chronically sleep deprived, that may be something you want to address. Movement, exercise, physical activity can help lower our blood pressure. And so why I think that's relevant is, let's say for argument's sake, you are someone who is salt sensitive, right? Sure. Try that for 6 weeks and see. And if you get a 2 millimeter reduction in your blood pressure, so let's say your blood pressure, we really want it around 120/80, let's say. I mean, this is not a blood pressure topic today, but
below 130 anyway.
Yeah. Okay. So let's say that's what we're aiming for optimally. And let's say yours is currently 150/92. And you think a low salt diet, which you don't enjoy, brings it down to 148/90. Okay, it's better, but then you could also do a trial and go, what if I go back to what I was eating, or, I go to more whole foods and I don't necessarily watch my salt intake, but what if I bring in a 30-minute walk every day, which actually I enjoy, gives me some physical activity, helps me with my cognitions, helping me sleep better. Or what if I do, if you're that way inclined, 5 to 10 minutes of meditation each day? You can start to self-experiment and go, actually, I have all these tools available to me. On balance, this is the tool that I can use, I can implement in my life. I enjoy it, and it's going to be sustainable for me. So yes, we need to be holistic within food, but we also need to be, in my view, holistic beyond food and go, there's many things that cause our blood pressure to go up. It's not just our foods.
But it's also a time to make change to your lifestyle. As you said, do more exercise. But, even if we're taking salt as this reductionist example, it's a great time to say the evidence shows that the more plants you eat, the lower your blood pressure. So go for the rest of your life to try and maximize your diversity of plants. Because
do you think that's because of potassium?
Yes.
That's awesome, isn't it? So instead of reducing salt, you just increase potassium.
We've got some data from the Zoe studies that says that, not only the number of plants, but if you divide them by the potassium ratios in each of those plants, it comes up very strongly. So that just by eating, my mantra of the 30 different types of plant a week, you will be getting a proportion of high potassium plants, mainly vegetables, that will lower your blood pressure. And so it's this holistic approach rather than this obsession with one thing, whether it's vitamin C or it's salt or it's it's all good. And I think this is where the science is accelerating so much that we are suddenly seeing it all come into focus and these things being linked up.
Ultra-processed foods has come up a number of times in this conversation. And I think I've heard you say, Tim, previously, I think I read it in your book, actually, that it seems to be the countries without strong food cultures that have been susceptible to being overrun with ultra-processed foods. Can you speak a little bit to that? Because I found that really, really interesting.
Yeah, there have been a number of surveys in the last 10 years that look at different countries and the proportion in each country of sort of total energy that is given by ultra processed foods. And the world leader is, of course, the United States. I think latest data, it's getting close to 70% of total food energy is in ultra processed food. The UK has gone up from 50 to 57%, and is the highest and worst in Europe. And you look at other countries, say in Europe, you see the southern European countries, it's much lower. So very low levels in Portugal, Italy, Spain, for example, where there's a very strong food culture, and it just hasn't made those inroads into the day-to-day eating. So kids, they won't be having ultra-processed food given to them in their food boxes, and the school dinners are properly prepared, or they go home for it, and people just wouldn't think of snacking in the same way that we do in the UK and the US. The idea of eating in your car or at your desk just doesn't sort of happen.
Yeah.
So there's a clear correlation between these food cultures and the progress of ultra-processed food, although depressingly, even in those countries, it's slowly creeping up.
Yeah.
Okay, and people used to say, oh, well, it's just because, it's related to poverty or other aspects of finance. But it turns out that some of the poorest countries, like Portugal compared to ourselves, they've got a fifth of the rates of ultra-processed foods. So I think that was why it got a hold, and why, in a way, there's no pushback against it. And in a way, I think ultra-processed food got its handle because those countries also spend relatively less on food than the ones with the food culture. So that's the other element to this, is the financial one. The percentage of GDP spent on food has been decreasing much faster in the US and the UK than in, say, these high food culture countries.
You tweeted that, I think, last week from the Times, that not a graph, almost like a chart showing what percentage of our income in different countries do we spend on food. And was it just Europe? I can't remember now. Maybe US was in it as well.
There was a number of countries around the world. And it's really fascinating. It's huge differences. And, we're complaining that we're going through a cost of living crisis in the UK here. And there was something about the news about how inflation has, the cost of food has doubled very recently in the last year. But we're still, on average, paying considerably less attention to our food bill compared to 10, 20 years ago, where, traditionally a large proportion of the family budget would go on food and food quality, which it still does in food culture countries. So we don't regard food as something to spend lots of money on. It's it's just a consumable energy source. And that's why, governments have been protecting it being cheap at all costs. Doesn't matter how unhealthy it is, it's got to be cheap. Otherwise, they fear there'll be a revolution in the streets, attacking the nanny state. And that just doesn't happen in these culture strong countries.
I guess to the British, the obvious, I won't even call it a cliche, the obvious country that would come to mind is France, with its very strong food culture and eating at a table culture. And I've written about this in one of my books, but I always remember this so well, that when my first book came out in France, and I did an interview with a French journalist, remote interview, this is maybe in 2018, 2019, something like that. I remember asking her, because she was in Paris, I said, look, my understanding is that everything I've seen, whenever I've been to France and my friends who are French and et cetera, you stop for lunch. You don't work at the computer. You know, you don't answer emails whilst you're eating. You sit down somewhere. It's there's a certain tradition around eating a meal. Is that still going on? And she said, yeah, this is still absolutely part of French culture. The only places where this is starting to get eroded are in the international companies in the center of Paris. And it's amazing how we're kind of exporting, well, America has exported its ultra-processed diet to the entire world, and it's making inroads everywhere. I'm not sure it's something that America should be proud of necessarily, but it's definitely one of the gifts it's given to the world.
Well, I think originally it was positive. You know, there was an idea that the world would starve if we didn't change our system, but we've now gone past that stage, and we can't stop the beast, if you like.
That's a great point. It's a great point, Sim, and you know, it's interesting to reflect back on that, how it did all start. So, Tim, I have, like you, been trying to communicate health messaging to the public for a number of years now. Maybe 10 years for me, but I don't know when you started communicating with the public on a big scale.
Well, I tried I guess about 13 years, but I wasn't very successful the first few years.
Well, you've definitely had a few clips from conversations you've had earlier on this year blow up in quite viral fashion and put a lot of attention on what you do. Let's talk about it. There was a clip cut from a podcast you were on Stephen's show, and wow, did it generate interest. And not only did that clip generate interest, there were videos being made about that clip. It truly went viral. Can you explain a little bit about that and how that all was for you?
Well, it was a bit of a shock. I had no idea. So, during the sort of 2-hour discussion, we discussed these points. Steve Bartlett's team are, incredibly professional about trying to get previews of the longer conversation. And we discussed a lot of these topics from a position that I don't think he'd discussed before about, and he didn't really, it was, I think, the first time really there'd been any real discussion on health and diet on his podcast. So he was asking from his point of view, do low calorie diets, should I go on a low calorie diet? Should I do this? And he was very surprised that I was prepared to be fairly dogmatic on this. And they used a very short clip to highlight this, hour and 45-minute discussion in a sort of Hollywood style clip where I was just giving one-word answers to these things, but and it was used as clickbait. But and it was obviously cut and edited, but it came across as very exciting. And I said, I think 2 things: calorie counting doesn't work, and exercise doesn't make you lose weight. I think they were the 2 key ones that sort of, to an audience that hadn't heard that before from anybody, I think it caused a real stir and led to, these 6 or 7 million downloads and lots of copycats and shock. And
Lewis Capaldi made a video, didn't he? I think, was it your kids who showed you that?
That's right. So, I had all these, the sort of under 30s who aren't exposed to these, the sort of chats that you and I are having, suddenly coming out, oh, I had no idea you were doing any of this, and I was suddenly, I'd made it because Lewis Capaldi was talking about me and did a video on me.
Your kids proud of you.
That's the first time they've ever been proud of me. That's right. So, but I think, and people said, "Oh, do I regret it? Wasn't it too sensational?" No, I don't think it was. If it got millions of people to look at that discussion, to talk about nutrition and food and health in a way that completely different to what they'd been brought up on, and the marketing and the other things that have been pointed at, particularly younger people, great. I think anyone who thinks that you can get nuance from a 30-second clip on Instagram or TikTok is very misguided, and you have to look at the bigger context. But I think it's great that we can have these discussions, and that in a way, food and nutrition can be an exciting topic that involves young people, and it's a bit of a wake-up call, really. And so, I don't have any regrets. Everyone knows that, I didn't just speak for 30 seconds and do that. It was, but it was. It's the same way that you advertise a Hollywood film with a trailer.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that you can watch that and get a sense of everything that's in it, but it's drawing people to this. And I think the more people that do understand these key things about calories and exercise and ultra processed food, the better. And that's the way we can change the world, and that's what I want to do.
Yeah, it was interesting watching all that because I think if people actually heard the conversation, there was so much more context there which is kind of, I guess to me, I would say obvious, but whether something's obvious or not is in the eye of the beholder.
Well, it is the danger of Instagram, and the fact that if you can't say it in your 90 seconds, no one's going to bother to look at it.
Yeah, and it used to be 60 seconds. It's gone up. And Tim, the truth is, I've been running this podcast now for maybe close to 5.5 years, and it's probably only been video the last 3.5 years, something like that, or maybe 4 years, I don't know. And this is a challenge we always have, which is I want context and nuance. Hence, we do these long-form conversations. The fourth time you've been on the show, you know what the show's about and how we do things. But then if you want to raise awareness and get people to listen to the conversation, but one way of doing that is to use platforms like Instagram, for some people TikTok, and these sort of social media platforms. And you could take the conservative approach and go, we're not going to play any of those games at all. And then you could argue that information that you have in your books, in that conversation, that is so valuable, that is going to help so many people improve their lives, it's not going to get anywhere, or it's going to be limited. I'm not saying these things are easy. This is something that me and my team think about a lot. How do you communicate these ideas?
But I think we're coming from a place, particularly in medicine, where we were told, really, don't do anything on the media. Don't put your name out there. You're sullying the reputation. You mustn't do anything. And so it takes a long time to overcome that.
Yeah.
And, if you have a 30-second clip on TikTok or Instagram that brings people to, say, this podcast, and this, we're talking in broad strokes here, but if they really want to go, they can go to the book and look up. And then if they want to go into those chapters, they can look at the references. That's what we want. We want people in that funnel, don't we? So I think people just got to realize that there are different levels of information, and it's all useful. And we just want people to get engaged at the level they're prepared to go to. And we shouldn't be frightened of starting at a way that attracts people into this discussion and funnel, even if it means some punchy, controversial terms. Obviously, there's some dangers if you tell people, give up. If I said, well, give up all your drugs, that would be wrong. But I don't think anything we're talking about is in that league.
You mentioned the two things which really got people's attention: exercise and weight loss, and calories. Would you like a bit of time just to clarify your views on both of those things?
Yes. So calories exist. I'm not a denier of a sort of physical fact that if you burn food in a jar, you can get heat off that is, you can measure food in that way. But so many people have gone through Weight Watchers, or they've been given these strict calorie controlled diets that make calorie the center of the universe. It's the only thing that matters. How many calories did I eat that day? And, it's massive business. Every time you go to the supermarket, all you see is reduced calories, only 400 calories, only this. And so for most people in this country, where we lack a food culture, that's the number one thing that most people have been bombarded with. Oh, I can't have that. I should have this. Eat this. And it's a total distraction from the quality of the food. And we now know that you give people 2 meals of identical calories, but completely different quality and makeup and macronutrients, it'll have a completely different effect on your body. So it's, for so many reasons, obsessing about the calorie is wrong. The quality of the food is far more important. If you eat good quality food, it doesn't make you as hungry. It changes when you next eat your meal. And it's impossible to actually count calories really accurately anyway. So, and even if you do, calorie restricted diets give you the 6-week improvement, as we all see, but virtually all bounce back to baseline, however hard you try. If you're only focusing on the calorie, which is what most the clinical trials and everything have done. So I think it's trying to move people away from this camouflage of calories being the most important thing about selecting your meal. And I particularly get upset in restaurants, this idea that we could solve all these problems by people in a fast food restaurant selecting something that had slightly less calories in it, because all the evidence shows is people then just get an extra dessert, or they get 2 of the low calorie ones, or they're not looking at the ingredients, or we're not. No one has said let's have a quality score, and that's something I'd love to do in the future with Zoe. Is actually, I've got in Food for Life lots of these tables where I've got my scores, but if you could start to give people gut friendly scores or things that are more holistic, that take into account the number of different plants, the lack of chemicals, all these other things that are bad. So calories, I'm not saying they don't exist, but quality of food is so much more important, and also how you eat and all these other things. And so, getting people from the onset to start thinking about what they're eating, not how many calories they're eating, is so much more important. That was really my point in that big discussion.
I think that's a very important point, Tim. And you said a couple of things there, virtually. So virtually everyone who does this in the trials that you're talking about have reverted back. And I know the third time you came on the show about, 9 months ago, we had a wonderful conversation. And I know we touched on calories in the middle there. And I remember saying to you, and I remember your answer as well, which was, look, if someone is calorie counting and they find it useful and they're getting the health outcomes they want with that, because some people will say that they find that really helpful. Personally
have written to me and said, Tim, you're completely wrong. I've been calorie counting for 10 years and, I enjoy it and it's great. And I'm not saying those people don't exist. I'm just saying they're not the norm.
Yeah. And I would agree with that. So, and again, we all have our biases. My bias is my clinical experience, what I have seen. I've never found it particularly helpful with people, but I know some personal trainers will say they found it incredibly helpful with their clients or for themselves, let's say, for example. But I think the wider point which your work, for me, always seems to make is that, let's say your goal is weight loss, right? And let's say you find counting calories helpful to help you meet that goal in the short term and hopefully in the long term. Okay. But if we look at food in a much more holistic way, if we think about food's impact on inflammation, food's impact on immune system balance and immune system regulation, if you look at food a lot more holistically, you go, well, calories doesn't take any of that into consideration. Technically, you could lose weight restricting calories or counting calories, But you could also be doing that with really poor quality food. So yes, on one hand, you could be getting weight loss, but on the other hand, you could be choosing foods that are increasing levels of inflammation and are causing or contributing to immune system dysfunction. We'll be back to the conversation in just a moment. Now, many of us struggle to find time to eat all of these incredible whole foods. That's why I'm a big fan of good quality whole food supplements like this one that's been in my own life for over 3 years now. It contains over 75 whole food source ingredients, vitamins, minerals, pre and probiotics, and it can help us support our energy, focus, digestion, and our immune system. Athletic Greens are giving my audience a fantastic offer. 1 year's free supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first order. You can see all the details at athleticgreens.com/live-more or simply click on the link below. Now, back to the conversation. So again, I'm not trying to confuse people. I'm trying to just, like you, Tim, just bring this more rounded approach to when we think about foods, which I just still think is missing massively.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I do recognize that it does work for some people. And for example, there are some type 2 diabetics who are very obese that do find, a kickstart if they're highly, if they're followed up and they've got a lot of supervision, it can be helpful for some of them. But, we're talking probably at most about 1 in 4, 1 in 5 people who are highly motivated can get some benefit from this. But for the sort of 80% of the rest of the population, all the data suggests that it is not the likely way forward. So it doesn't mean you should never try it. I'm not saying, but I just think even though the act of trying it means that you're ignoring all the scientific evidence about food quality and your long-term health. And I'd much rather people sort of heal themselves from the inside out, rather than just reducing the fat on the outside and doing it that way. And I think if we start thinking in that holistic way and treating these things as long-term problems, not a sort of 3-month problem,
and generally that really echoes my own clinical experience, which has been, not always, but generally speaking, when you focus on improving health by a variety of things that we've already measured, when you focus on improving health by improving the quality of the food you're eating, how much you're moving, how much you're sleeping, how much stress you are being constantly exposed to, it is amazing how often weight loss, when it is needed for health, comes along as a side effect. So rather than the weight loss being the focus, often when you do the other things right, which has always been my approach, the weight loss comes along as a beautiful side effect for certain people.
Well, that's exactly what we're finding with the Zoe program, where we're not promoting it as a weight loss product. We're just saying we're going to change the way you eat to, get less of this inflammation and less of the sugar spikes. And as you said, as a side effect, many people are losing small amounts of weight, but, in a sustainable long-term way, rather than this sort of crash diet and rebound. So I think people do realize it, that particularly if you look after your gut microbiome, all those immune benefits start to build up and have the this great impact and reduce problems of aging and help protect you against cancer, help you deal with adverse problems in life. And I think we've just got to get this across that yes, there are some people that need a kickstart, which could be in a very few people they might benefit from crash diets, but now we've got to deal with the Ozempic and other weight loss drugs that, again, if that's not done carefully, then those people will be thinner, but they will, if they're not improving their diet, their health isn't necessarily going to improve. Or you've got bariatric surgery, which, is the other way to permanently sort of reduce weight. And I think we've got to, in all these discussions, start educating people about food quality because of these longer other effects.
Exercise and weight loss. What is your nuanced view on this?
If you want to lose weight exercise is one of the least useful things you can do, and all the trials show that it has very either no or very, very modest effects in randomized controlled trials. So this is where people are overweight are allocated to, say, physios or exercise or just videos and focusing on the food. So there's no doubt that that's what the studies show, the randomized real studies, which is the only way you can really test this. There is some evidence that once you have lost weight, so you've improved your diet, that if you are exercising, it reduces the rate of rebound. So as we explained, everyone can lose weight in the first 3 months of any sort of diet, and people who do no exercise at all do tend to go back even faster or above where they started from if they're not exercising. So there seems to be something there. It's not a huge effect, but it's something. So the summary of the clinical trials, not my work, it's other people's, shows no benefits of exercise on weight loss. But if you have managed to lose weight, there is some evidence that it might help about 10% to keep it off. So this is very different to what most people are told when they go to sign up for their gym membership in January, and they're told all this nonsense about burning fat and all these different zones in the body and how you've got to do all this as if it's some well worked out science that you just by being on treadmills you just burn off the fat in your body, because all that does really is makes you hungrier and alters your metabolism, so that instead of having a fairly active metabolism to burn up the energy, your body slows it all down. So it's a sort of reflex. So exercise is fantastic for your health. It's great for your mental health. It's great to avoid cancers, heart disease, virtually every disease we know about, apart from maybe arthritis. But it is not a useful tool for most people. Because I'm talking about trials where they look at the averages. And in every single trial, if it shows no benefit of exercise on weight loss, that means that as many people benefited as failed.
Yeah.
And some people, when they exercise, will put on weight, and other people will lose weight. And what the trials show is that the average is in the middle. So by all means, give it a go, because
you might be.
You might be in that lucky group that does respond, but don't expect that you can alter things without changing your diet, because on average, most people will not purely get that benefit, and some might be worse off.
Yeah.
And I think that's the important thing. It's the understanding of all these clinical trials is that they're summing all these individuals and drawing a line between them in the same way we've always done with nutrition, which is where we've gone wrong. But you can expect, like tossing a coin, to get better or worse if you exercise. Many people just feel much hungrier, and suddenly they're going home, they're raiding the fridge, and their metabolism slows down. They sit down in front of the sofa, and it's having a negative effect on them. Others might be lucky and get a beneficial effect.
I think that's a key message from this conversation, Tim, is that none of us are average. None of us are necessarily that average conclusion in that study. And for people who find benefit, that when they exercise, it helps them to lose weight, fantastic, I'm sure you would say. But I think why this information is really important to share is because there's a lot of people who are slogging themselves on treadmills in gyms getting frustrated, feeling like failures because they can't understand why they're not losing weight despite putting in 5-6 hours at the gym each week. I think for that individual, that's very, very helpful to go, oh, wait a minute, maybe I'm one of these non-responders. Maybe this isn't the right approach to me. So I think that's worth saying. For me also, when I think about exercise and weight loss, or exercise and general health, but let's talk about it in the context of weight loss. I think Herman Ponce's research from 2 or 3 years ago was really quite profound at showing that just adding in exercise, doesn't mean that that's going to be additive to your calorie burn that day. Yes, sure, you've done some exercise, but your body can compensate and downregulate other parts of calorie expenditure. I think that was a brilliant study.
Yeah, we're not machines. We're not this in and out machine. This is this going back to the calories thing that people say, oh, well, my watch has just told me I've done another 200 calories exercise. I can eat a donut or whatever it is. And it's just, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, it doesn't work that way. For me, one of the main reasons to move your body whilst trying to, let's say, lose weight, if that's your goal, is because I think people feel good when they're moving. There's something really, I think in terms of self-esteem and how you feel about yourself and your mood, I think that often gets improved, particularly if you're sedentary and you start to move. And that in turn makes it more likely you're going to be able to stick with, let's say, your dietary changes or engage in other lifestyle behaviors, like maybe going to bed half an hour early or whatever it might be. So I think all this stuff is quite nuanced. I think you wanted to respond there.
Well, I don't think it's true for everybody. So you take the Lewis Capaldis of the world, right? Some people absolutely hate the idea of going to a gym and doing exercise or, running or jogging or doing this stuff, and the sort of endorphin rush that many people get is like a negative, this sort of feeling of, and I've had patients like this, with ankylosing spondylitis. You said, well, if you don't exercise or stretch, you're going to get worse. And they said, I'd rather be worse. I can't,
Yeah.
And it does happen, right? So there are these people, but I think what is interesting is these micro changes. Sitting at your desk and fidgeting your feet can reduce sugar spikes. Getting up every 20 minutes and going up and down the stairs to get a cup of coffee can, if done over many hours, is another way of exercising. So I think it's also realizing there's so many different ways people can do things and sort of hacks to their body that we need to realize. And we mustn't assume that, the same exercise works for everybody, because we're talking about personalization.
Of course.
And I think we've got to be, more open and realize that you can give people the tools, but they say, listen, there's a big menu out there, just like all these foods and these other options. I think exercise has to be seen in a much wider buffet of ways to do it for people who don't like this stuff.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. I guess what I was getting at is more not necessarily slogging yourself at the gym, but like I've got some patients in mind where I would tell them to keep, I said, okay, you don't want to go to the gym, you don't want to work out, no problem. Okay, can we keep a dumbbell or a kettlebell in your kitchen? Something, I talk about a lot. I think small little exercise snacks can be very useful. And for people who don't like exercise, I have tried, and this really does work with a lot of people, say, okay, every time you put your kettle on, just pick up that weight and do 5 bicep curls in each arm. That's it. Then put it down. If you have 3 cups of tea a day, that's you lifting that weight 30 times a day, 210 times a week, almost 1,000 times a month. And I have found for people who don't like to, in inverted commas, work out in the way in which they think they need to work out, that can be incredibly powerful from a psychological perspective. Like, wow, I feel good that I'm lifting a heavy-ish weight. It makes me feel good, which I think psychology also plays a massive role in how we engage with nutrition changes, lifestyle changes. And so, yeah, it's super rounded. Personalization is the key. In terms of your 20 tips, Tim, in chapter 33.
We've done one of them, so you got the
we done one of them. Well, people can get the book, right? It's a very thorough and well-researched book. I really like this one. In fact, I've got it underlined, 16. I'm not just trying to cover controversial topics, but this is something I feel very passionate about. Tip number 16. Understand that food is medicine and the right diets can be as effective as many drugs.
Yes, and I've changed my mind on this. Certainly, since I was a practicing doctor, where we dismissed nutrition as being pretty trivial compared to our powerful drugs that we're all love to prescribe. And I think I think the field of cancer has really opened my eyes to this about the power of nutrition. But just epidemiologically, calculations have said that if we moved the UK from its current diet to an optimum diet, we would reduce chronic illness, chronic diseases by about 70%.
70%.
So this is extrapolating from, you take the sort of healthiest quartile of the population, the worst quartile, and you move the average down to the best one. There's not many medicines that would have that effect at this population level. Of course, these are models, and you can criticize those. But the other thing that makes me really believe this is our work in cancer, and I was running a consortium between a Dutch group and our group in the UK on melanoma, people who had metastatic melanoma, who in the past, had very poor prognosis and outcome, but now they're these new immunotherapy drugs that, work, can suddenly save lives. So they're suddenly getting a third or more of people surviving, forever. It's very dramatic, and rates are getting higher all the time. Now, we looked at the effect of diet on the baseline and the microbiome, and it nearly doubled the success rate of the drug just by being on the right diet and having the right gut microbes at the beginning of that study. So you suddenly start thinking, wow, in a way, it's acting just like a drug, this food. And if we just knew, and if it had the same backing as pharmaceutical products, we could do so much with it. And there's lots of data also about using things like mushrooms as adjuvants for chemotherapy, where they increase survival rates by 20%. So that's why suddenly I've got this, I've changed my mind, because I thought it was, it is controversial. Basically most of our traditional medical colleagues would say, we're nutters if we said that. But we're getting all this really good science now, building up to show the key importance of what foods we eat, how that affects our gut microbes, this huge effect on our immune systems.
Sorry to interrupt. If you are enjoying this content, there's loads more just like it on my channel. So please do take a moment to press subscribe, hit the notification bell, and now back to the conversation.
And that's why, when we take these artificial sweeteners, there's a new study out last week saying erythritol, which is one of these sugar alcohols, has really big effects on immune cells, and could be used as either for good or bad. Either in terms of autoimmune disease, it could save people, or it has other effects. So I think once you devolve food to its chemical form, and we take it more seriously, rather than as calories and macronutrients, it becomes just like pharmaceutical products, and very little difference. Artificial sweeteners, what are they? They're chemicals made from the petrochemical industry. So they can be, good or bad. So the same, we can visualize that.
Yeah.
We don't see food in the same way. But once you start to do that, it makes sense that food definitely is medicine.
I completely agree that food is medicine. I know that, as you say, there is a selection of medical doctors who push back at that. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this over the past few years because, first of all, each to their own, right? If I use that term with my patients and have done for many years, and when I explain what I mean by that, I think patients find it incredibly useful. That's what they fed back to me. But if you don't like that term, okay, great, don't use it. But one of the definitions of medicine, I think, is a drug or preparation that we can use to prevent or treat disease. Now, I think on that definition, food absolutely fits. I mean, you can take a whole selection of different diseases, type 2 diabetes being a very obvious one, where you can use food as medicine. You can use food to put your type 2 diabetes into remission, right? I struggle to see how it's controversial to call food medicine in that context, for example. I think there's a wider issue. There is a weighting issue to consider as well. Like, if we say no, medicine is medicine, but food's important, but it's not medicine, I think we're undervaluing how important food is. And I think what we're doing is we're reinforcing the message that it's about the drugs. That's what's really going to sort things out for you. Yeah, change your diet on the side a little bit if you want, but it's really the drugs. And in this prescribing lifestyle medicine course that me and Dr. Panja teach, Royal College of GP accredited course, we often do this role play at the end of the whole day's teaching, where we go through. I'm the sample. He's the patient. I'm the doctor. We go through 2 sample consultations where someone's been given a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. And essentially, it's a bit of fun at the end of the day, but it really helps highlight this point for me, whereby if you spend the first 9 minutes of the 10-minute consultation talking about drugs and how important they are, and then as the patient is walking to the door, you say, if you could just improve your diet and lose a bit of weight, it's also going to help. What message does the patient get when they leave? The message is, yeah, I know he told me to change my diet and lose a bit of weight, without any advice on how I may go about doing that. But yeah, he did say that. But essentially, he spent 90% of the time talking about these drugs that I need to take. They're going to go out with a certain message. Whereas in the second consultation that we do on stage, we spend the first 90% of the time explaining to the patient, yes, there are some drugs we can use, but there are also things in your lifestyle that may have caused this to come in the first place. There's things that we can still manipulate and change. Are you interested in me helping you understand what those things are? Same consultation time, 2 very different messages in that patient's mind. So that's the second reason why I believe food is medicine. But the third piece, Tim, and I think this really speaks to what we were talking about before about food cultures, and how you were saying that the cultures with strong food cultures have generally, I'm sure not in every case, but generally have been a little bit more resistant to the kind of infiltration of the food industry and ultra-processed foods. There's a lot of cultures around the world, including, the culture I'm from, an Indian culture, where saying, like, is food medicine is one of the most ridiculous questions you could ask. Of course, food is medicine. It's not even something that's worthy of debate. So I think this denigration of food as medicine concept, which is you're also denigrating a lot of cultures and their beliefs. It's not just Indian culture, there's a lot of South American cultures. And I think that's relevant because we're living in a global world. Immigration, in every country, you've got people with different cultures living there now, certainly here in the UK. So I think I think it's a little bit problematic when we say food is not medicine. So that's my 3-point case for saying why I think it is. So I'd love you to respond.
Well, I mean, I've been to some conferences that are, called, food as medicine, or I've sometimes given a talk with that title. And yet some people say, well, you can't say that. You're going to some wacko conference, right? This is just fringe medicine. And I think this is the reason that there's so much pushback from some of our colleagues on this, is they're super worried that people are going to not take their prescribed drugs. They're going to take turmeric or lion's mane mushrooms instead. And and it's been an us or them scenario. So you go
black or white thinking, which is dangerous.
You go with terminal cancer. Someone says, "Oh, well, chances aren't very good, but I'll give you this drug." And some people will go and see a functional medicine doctor and get chances are very similar because the prognosis is very bad. And they're worried about in the past, and this is what I'm talking about. But this is traditionally where I think people are. That's why many doctors are worried about food as medicine. Also, they don't know enough about it. So suddenly they're being told food is medicine, but I don't know anything about food or nutrition. We didn't have any training. I've had no updates in the last 20 years. It's not surprising. But I do think, there are some areas. I mean, if you turned it round and you said, okay, you've been diagnosed with cancer, unfortunately, you're going to see your oncologist, and you say, I like to, would you like to know one thing that is going to double your rate of survival? Or do you want to discuss, all the different chemotherapy regimes? They don't do that.
Yeah.
And, I think it's becoming increasingly desperate that this is a vital part of what the patient wants to do something, and they're not given those options. And yet all the data is pointing more and more towards, they help each other. It's not one or the other. They are both important chemicals that can save your life.
Yeah, I mean, all information, if taken to an extreme, can be problematic. And I feel as a profession, we do need a bit more humility to sort of say, look, there's plenty we don't know. There's plenty we weren't taught at medical school. It doesn't mean it's not valid. And once you have learnt how to use food as medicine, this is my bias, because I wasn't taught how to do this. I had to go and learn how to do this and use it to, let's say, help someone put type 2 diabetes into remission, or help them with their depression, as Felice Jacka showed in her 2017 SMILES trial. I think it's pretty hard to see that trial and go how, yes, they were already on some sort of therapy, and 12 weeks on a modified Mediterranean diet versus the control group who just, I think, were given social support, statistically significant improvement in depression. It's pretty hard to say, well, that food is not medicine. Food.
Yeah, and so every psychiatrist, or GP who's facing someone with depression, it should be the first thing they do is say, let's talk about your diet. What do you eat? They might have a good diet in the first place, in which case you say, okay, well, then we're not going to optimize that. Let's do it. But if you don't ask and you don't have it as part of your armory, then, in the same way with whether it's cancer or depression or diabetes, I think we're absolutely missing a huge trick in this country, that we're being overwhelmed with bad diets and food. It ought to be the number one question all doctors ask their patients as soon as they come in, and we're just not equipped for it. We don't have the resources for it. There aren't enough people trained in it, and we have to work out how do people get that information, and that's really what I'm about. And if a few GPs read this book, or patients, this is the starting point. And but this is not it's not that hard.
It's not. That's it. It really isn't. Like, we can make this really complicated. But as I've said many times on the show, what I will do with pretty much all my chronic disease patients, if time and setting allows for this, is encourage them to completely switch to a whole food unprocessed diet for 2 to 3 weeks. And that intervention has changed the way I practice medicine. I've been doing that for about 10 years. It has completely transformed the way I practice medicine, because it doesn't mean every problem goes away, but it's amazing how many things start to get significantly better. So you then see, what am I left with now? What am I left with once that's gone out of the equation? And it does a very powerful thing of teaching that individual to go, oh, wow, I had no idea how much my food choices was affecting my day-to-day health.
People don't. People got no clue. And it's also empowering to say to someone, rather than just, well, what's the next tablet you're going to give me, doc?
Yeah.
To say, well, actually, I'm not going to give you anything, but this is a paragraph of what you need to do. Do this for 2 weeks and come back. But it seems so obvious, and you just wonder, well, we have, I don't know how many, 20 million sick people in this country. All of them should be given that advice today, and they're not.
Yeah, completely agree. I mean, Tim, we've not even scratched the surface. I mean, I was hoping to go through more things that you've changed your mind on, like bread, meat, fish. We touched a little bit on mushrooms. Of course, it's all there in the book for people. It's a very, very thorough book, right? It's very, very comprehensive. If I had to ask you to choose your favorite chapter, what would you say?
My favorite chapter, I got a bit depressed writing it because it took so long. So it took 6 years. But I think my favorite chapter is actually the future of food. It's the one where I can see light at the end of the tunnel. It's not all about the harmful effects of ultra-processed food. It's not about obesity. I can see us new technologies, particularly with fermented foods and what's called precision fermentation, and uses of microbes to actually grow proteins. That I see that as hugely exciting. And I get interactions with a lot of these startup companies who are making these stem cell meats and stem cell fish. You can now get prawns out of a test tube that will have such a huge impact on climate change and the world if we can embrace it. And some of these are much closer than people think. We're probably within 3 years of getting meat substitutes that taste the same and are cheaper than the traditional American burger patty.
How does that fit with ultra-processed foods? Because one of the critiques at some of these meat substitutes is that they're highly, highly processed, potentially not as good for the environment as is being marketed. So how do you put all that together?
Well, that's definitely true for the current versions. So yes, they're better for the environment. They're probably not much different for your health. They're compared to a cheap burger, the artificial burger has lots of things you don't really want in there. But the next version, I've seen prototypes that are a really clean label. They've got no artificial ingredients at all. They're using bacterial fermentation to break down my friend's mushrooms and tomatoes and other things into something that really tastes, if you just cook it right, just like meat. And it's got lots of fiber and plants in it. So I see there's this huge potential for this revolution as we get rid of cheap meat and dairy and we replace it with either a combination of these sort of stem cell foods that we ferment to give them extra texture and flavor, and possibly as probiotics that we actually use them, in a nutritious way, plus actually creating protein, getting bacteria and yeast to actually make proteins that we can put into foods, but knowing all the problems that went into ultra-processed before, we can do this properly. So that was the bit that really filled me with some optimism, because a lot of this is, to read about our current food, there are lots of, depressing bits in it. And people say, well, there's no future. But, a lot of this book is about the environment. We haven't really discussed that. So it's, taking each of the foods from an ethical standpoint, a health standpoint, but also what effect you have on the environment. And we've talked about food choices being, the food choices we make are the most important thing we make for our health. You might argue differently, but I certainly think food choice is number one. But it's also the most important thing we can do as individuals for the planet and climate change. And this whole future of food has got to bring in the planet as well as our gut microbes, as well as our health. So there's the sort of the three things there. So I think there's lots of fantastic tech in there that I think, because they're starting from scratch, they can actually do this properly. And I was very excited by that. So that's the bit that cheered me up. And that's why I call it my favorite chapter.
Well, you've certainly set the scene now for our follow-up conversation, our fifth conversation on my podcast, Tim, because we've not really touched on the environment, which of course is something that's front and center in many people's minds. I know there's a lot of controversies there, which is really worthy of a full-on conversation to go through. Again, I don't think we've even scratched the surface about what's in this book. There's chapters on fruits, on vegetables, on legumes, on rice, on pasta, breads.
What's your favorite rice?
White rice.
Do you know Uncle Ben's rice comes out as one of the healthiest ones?
Does it?
Yeah.
In terms of blood sugar?
In terms of nutrients.
Really?
Yes. And just because it's parboiled. So anything that's parboiled means you seal in a lot of the nutrients. So there are some surprising things in the book here that...
there's loads of surprising stuff, there really is. And
brown rice is not that much better than white rice. That's the other depressing thing.
I found that really interesting, and we didn't really get into glyphosate and BPAs and Teflon and arsenic and the things I wanted to cover. So maybe we'll save that for the next one. But I find it, even in terms of rice, my parents are from Kolkata in India, right? Bengali. And the way Bengalis do rice is you will get, you'll put the rice in a, I don't know, in some sort of pan, and you'll rinse it 3 times. And I remember as a kid, mum say, because you take off the excess starch, right? Whereas the way some other cultures, or my wife, who's also Indian, but from a Gujarati background, she'll do it slightly differently. Or I know some countries in the Far East will, they'll make sticky rice in a way that all that water is part of it. So even the lowly white rice can be made in a whole selection of different ways that is likely to have a different blood sugar profile and all kinds of things. So I find it really, really interesting.
Yeah, no, as you get into it, you just get more and more, getting down in these little rabbit holes. It was really fun.
Tim, just to finish off, yesterday was quite a significant day for me. I didn't realize it until I was thinking about it over dinner. It was 10 years yesterday since my dad died. And Dad's ill health and that journey of caring for Dad and now for my mum has played a huge part in my adult life. It's informed a lot of what I do now, how I interact with people, how I think about health. And I recently heard you talk about your dad, who I believe died quite suddenly when he was when you were 21 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I often wonder what my dad would think of my career today. He's a conventional medical doctor, I wonder what he would think of all the things that his son now talks about in books and podcasts all over the world now. What do you think your dad would think about what you're doing?
I don't know. He wrote some books, and as he died, he was writing a book called Social Pathology, which was trying to link psychology and social science with pathology. So I think he'd have actually embraced a lot of the in a way, vulgarization of the science to the public. I think, I think he would have appreciated it, and he was a questioning. He was a research doctor as well, or a pathologist, and had a questioning mind. So I think he would have been fascinated by what I'm doing now. Probably a bit surprised that I'd ended up in this particular area from where I was at the age of 21, where I wasn't looking like I had much potential at all. I would say.
Do you think the fact that he was an author has influenced you in terms of you now writing books? Is any part of that related to your dad, do you think?
I think possibly. I did update he wrote a pathology book, which was quite a dull topic, if you remember, in medical school.
I do.
But he did have a few jokes in it. And so I did enjoy those bits that, it's like we had the same sense of humor, the sarcasm and sort of rather black humor. So I did edit his book, another edition, as the number of cytokines increased, there were only 2 interleukins when he wrote it. And I think there's now over 35. But that gave me a little taste of it. So that probably made it easier for me to go on and write books, which is for most people quite a big step, as you know, because it's a huge commitment, and that stops most people doing it. But the sad bit is I didn't know him that well, and that was my big sort of regret, is that at 21, just starting to have a sort of adult relationship with your parents, and then it got cut short, and I was very busy as a medical student, so he didn't get much time. So, but I'd like to think he was he's up there somewhere, smiling at all this attention about me talking about exercise and calories.
I'm sure he is, Tim. I'm sure he would be incredibly proud of you. I think you have done a fabulous job over the last years at putting real food on the map, helping people understand that they can make choices in their own life that will improve their health, their family's health, the planet's health. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Been a pleasure.
If you enjoyed that conversation, I think you are really going to enjoy this one about the impact of sugar on your body and brain.
When you consume sugar, you are poisoning your mitochondria. Sugar and cyanide do the same thing. This is the toxin.